Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. On an exceptionally blustery spring evening, in the third week of March 1895, Sherlock Holmes and I sat in front of a little fire at 221B Baker Street. Outside, the wind howled like a disgruntled beast through the chimney flue, and the gas lights below flickered in protest. Holmes had spent much of the day reading an abstruse monograph on bell metallurgy, a subject that appeared to me to have little practical application until, as so frequently happened, the mundane became mysterious. The knock came as the hour approached 9 o'clock. 3 swift raps on the downstairs door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's light stride as she mounted. A little later, she entered with a card on a small silver salver. Holmes, lounging in his dressing gown, picked it up and inspected it without expression. "Ah," he muttered, "the Reverend Simon Calloway. I assume the vicarage is at St. James's, Highbury. A curious hour for a man of the cloth." He rose with ease and fixed the cuffs of his robe. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, if you please." A few minutes later, the man himself walked in, a gaunt, ascetic figure with a hawkish nose and deeply sunken eyes that appeared to be shadowed by more than candlelight. His black coat was beautifully pressed, yet his hands trembled slightly when he removed his gloves. "Mr. Holmes," he started in a gentle yet precise voice, "I trust you will excuse the lateness of my call. I've come to you with a most peculiar, perhaps even profane issue." Holmes motioned to the chair opposite his own. "Please, Reverend. Dr. Watson and I are accustomed to odd hours and odder cases. Please tell us what brought you here tonight." The Reverend sat stiffly and placed his hat in his lap. "It concerns the bell tower at St. James's," he told me. "The enormous bell has tolled exactly 1:30 in the morning the last 2 nights. Only once. No wind has blown. When the bell is not in use, the pull rope is coiled and locked away in the vestry. There is no trace of forced entrance, and there is no earthly reason for the bell to chime. But it does." Holmes leant forward slightly. "Once per night? No more?" "Precisely. A heavy toll. And then nothing. Have you considered the possibility of pranksters?" Calloway's pale lips tightened. "St. James's is solidly built in the old style, stone and iron. The vestry remains shut and the grounds are gated. The lock shows no tampering. The belfry itself is 30 feet high and only accessible via an iron spiral staircase, which I have personally examined each morning. And still the bell rings." Holmes tucked his fingers beneath his chin. "I assume the bell is not on any sort of timer or mechanical device." "None. It is drawn by hand with a rope. There is no winding-up mechanism. The bell was cast in 1784 and has always been rung by hand. The tower is fairly isolated. No neighboring structures rise close enough for access." Watson, intrigued despite himself, leaned forward. "Is there any significance to the time? 1:30. The vicar paused. "Only that? It was the hour when Father Greaves died. My predecessor. He died in the belfry 5 years ago this month on March 19th. The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of Holmes's violin metronome on the mantel. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained brisk. "And you say this has happened 2 nights now?" "Yes, March 18th and last night 19th. "Then if the pattern holds," Holmes said, rising with sudden energy, "we may expect it again tonight." Calloway made a sharp nod. "That's why I came. I do not know whether this is a matter of trespass, trickery, or something more. But the bell should not ring, but it does." Holmes moved to his writing desk and opened a drawer. "Watson," he remarked sharply, "I believe our evening will not be wasted on inactivity. Reverend, you may return to the vicarage. Dr. Watson and I will arrive at St. James's before midnight and await the toll ourselves." The Reverend stood, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'll leave the gate unlocked and await you in the vestry. I assume no arrangements are required?" "None," Holmes answered, already donning his overcoat. "We bring with us only patience and a lantern." As the door closed behind the Reverend, Holmes turned to me with a ghostly smile. "Watson, this is a bell that rings without wind. Intriguing. Let us check if the dead can genuinely keep time." The wind had died down by the time Holmes and I stepped out into the street. replaced by a fine mist that clung to the cobblestones and turned the gaslight halos into golden blurs. Holmes strode quickly and purposefully, his cloak flaring behind him like a shadow with a mind all its own. I followed in silence, accustomed to these nocturnal excursions, but still amazed at how quickly he could switch from idle abstraction to razor-edged focus. The hansom cab dropped us off at the edge of Highbury, where small streets gave way to stone paths and the melancholy silhouettes of parish buildings. St. James's Church stood alone at the corner of a quiet street, its bell tower towering over the trees. Its tiny windows looked blankly into the darkness, and the slight glimmer of lamplight through the vestry window verified that Reverend Calloway was there as promised. We passed through the iron gate, which creaked softly on its hinges, and walked up the stone pathway. Holmes paused only once to run his gloved fingers along the inside of the wrought iron fence. A small smear of what appeared to be dust or ash clung to the iron, but he said nothing. Inside the vestry, there was a faint odor of candle wax, rain-soaked stone, and old wood. Reverend Calloway stood near a small stove, with a kettle warming on top, his eyes betraying both fatigue and quiet dread. "I've made sure the bell rope stays locked in the cupboard," he said without hesitation, pointing to a heavy iron cabinet mounted on the wall. "There are no other means to ring it from below." Holmes nodded, but he was not listening. His eyes had already begun to move around the room, studying the walls, the scuffed floorboards, and the candle stubs on a nearby table. He moved toward the narrow stone stairwell that led upward into the tower, his steps making scarcely a sound. "Has anyone else access to the church at this hour?" he asked over his shoulder. "No one," said Calloway, following behind. "I carry the only key, and I swear to you I have not left it unattended." Yet the bell tolled. This means that either your trust was misplaced, or something more unusual is going on. Holmes arrived at the first landing and held up his lantern, its glow catching the old spiderwebs tucked into the crevices of the corners. "Have you heard any other sounds? Voices, footsteps, rustlings?" "Nothing. Only the single toll. It's awfully loud in the silence. Afterward there is nothing." Holmes said nothing more, but his pace slowed as we ascended. The spiral staircase narrowed as it rose, the stone worn smooth at the center from decades of use. The air grew colder and sharper the higher we went, and the wind, what little remained, whispered against the louvres near the bell housing. The belfry itself was a square chamber of rough-hewn stone, open to the night through 4 tall arched vents, which allowed the sound of the bell to carry across the parish. The great bell hung from a massive oak beam, its iron clapper resting still and silent. Holmes examined the mechanism closely, noting the thick coil of rope wound around its spindle, and the iron ring bolted through the floor that anchored it. "No sign of recent movement," he murmured, brushing a finger over the beam. "No wear on the rope? No footprints in the dust?" He crouched, then lay flat against the cold floor, peering beneath the bell platform with that same unnerving stillness he often displayed when deep in observation. After a long moment he rose and stepped to the edge of the tower, gazing out through the vent to the graveyard beyond. "Look there, Watson." Near the wall left of the yew tree. I followed his gaze and saw what he meant, a faint disturbance in the earth, no more than a darker patch against the grass, but unmistakable once seen. A track perhaps, or the remnant of something dragged. Could be a gardener's wheelbarrow, I offered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps someone meant to come and go without being seen." Reverend Calloway had remained respectfully silent, but now he spoke with hesitation. "There was a vagrant some weeks ago, an old man. He slept behind the vestry for several nights. I asked him to move along, of course. When was this?" "Mid-February. I haven't seen him since." Holmes nodded but didn't press the matter. Instead, he walked a full circle around the bell, stopping briefly to shine his light up into the hollow curve of the bronze casting itself. "Do you know," he said suddenly, "that certain vibrations can mimic the effects of a bell toll? It is not necessary to pull the rope. A sufficient blow to the beam or a resonant pitch could disturb the clapper just enough." "But who would do such a thing?" I asked, "and why only once per night?" "That," Holmes replied, "is precisely what we shall try to learn. And we must do it quickly, for it is nearly the appointed hour." Reverend Calloway checked his pocket watch and paled. 5 minutes to the half-hour. Holmes stepped back into the corner and extinguished the lantern. We were left in near total darkness, the faint glow of the city lights only a distant haze beyond the vents. The silence pressed upon us heavily, an almost sacred stillness that made the ticking of my own watch sound like hammer blows. Then it happened. A sound, deep, thunderous, absolute. One heavy toll, reverberating down through the tower's stones and into the marrow of my bones. It came not from beneath, but from above, as though the air itself had been struck. Reverend Calloway crossed himself instinctively. Holmes didn't move. But I noticed his eyes sparkle in the dark, their brightness evident even in the absence of light. "The clapper did not move," he muttered. I was watching. The bell rang, but the clapper remained still. For a minute I was too astonished to react, but how? "There is no time, come." He lit the lantern again and descended the steps 2 at a time, his coat brushing against the walls as we went. He paused briefly in the vestry to grab his gloves and cane. "We are not dealing with ghosts," he stated flatly. "We are dealing with cunning and tools." He turned to face the Reverend. "You say no one enters or leaves?" "Yes. The gate is locked," Holmes beckoned to me. "Watson, check it now." I hurried down the path and out onto the street. The iron gate remained latched. There were no new footsteps on the walk, only our own leading in. Holmes stepped out beside me, examining the ground, then moved to the church wall and knelt. He took something from the base of a drainpipe and gave it to me, a thin copper wire no longer than a finger and slightly kinked. "This," he explained, was fastened to the beam that supported the bell. Someone generated a resonating trigger, possibly from the graveyard wall. A harmonic vibration transmitted via the iron or wood. "But why go to such lengths?" I asked. Holmes made a tight smile. "Because the toll is not the message, but the signal. Someone wants the bell to sound at a specific moment, and I plan to find out who receives it." The wind had resumed, rising in soft gusts. Holmes turned back toward the church, his gaze piercing. "Tonight, Watson," the bell announced the time. "Tomorrow night, I aim to reveal the truth." As we returned to Baker Street, the sky began to fade at the edges, but the lamplighters continued to make their final rounds below. Holmes remained standing through most of the ride, fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the fogged glass of the handsome window. I knew better than to disturb him when his mind had detected a trail. When we arrived, he went straight to his desk, pulling out drawers and scattering monographs and scrapbooks with the efficiency of a man in search of a single, concealed item. Finally, with a slight grunt of satisfaction, he presented a yellowed piece from the Evening Standard from nearly 2 years ago. He handed it to me without a word. The headline stated, "Arrest in Highbury Smuggling Circle, Ring Broken by Sudden Police Raid." I scanned the piece quickly. It revealed the dismantling of an illicit smuggling organization that went via numerous tradespeople in North London. Among those imprisoned was Eli Grafton, a stonemason who had previously worked on the repair of several local churches. Grafton had disappeared during the trial, evading arrest the day before the verdict was to be announced. Holmes leaned over my shoulder. "Notice the location." Grafton was last seen in Islington, just a few blocks from St. James's. More intriguingly, he was noted for his one-of-a-kind ability to conceal contraband in brickwork, with such precision that even masons overlooked it. "You think the bell's toll was a signal to someone still operating?" "I suppose," Holmes said, walking to the window and staring out at the slow crawl of dawn, "that the Tower of St. James's shelters more than bats. A man like Grafton would not vanish unless he had a bolt hole, and what better place than a structure he had helped to build or restore?" The idea seemed absurd, but I had long since learned not to dismiss Holmes's theories out of hand. He talked again with fresh vigor. "We return to the church tonight. But now I need 2 things, a map of St. James's original construction blueprints, and a word with the verger if he's still alive. By mid-morning, I'd found the original designs in the Diocese of London's offices, hidden behind 3 volumes of parish registers and sealed in cracking leather rolls. Holmes seized them all at once and spread them across the table, his fingers following the lines like a pianist looking for a song. "Here," he replied last, tapping at the base of the bell tower, a service crawl space. Narrow, unused since the 1860s, when gas lighting was briefly installed and then abandoned. It goes behind the tower's southern wall, emerging through a trapdoor slightly below the nave. It's curious that Reverend Calloway never mentioned it. Perhaps he doesn't know of it, which makes it even more interesting. Later that afternoon, we met with Mr. Addison, the elderly verger who had retired 8 years before but remained at the parish. He welcomed us into his small cottage, not far from Highbury Fields. Time had twisted his back and dulled his eyes, but his memories seemed to remain keen. That old crawlspace, he wondered, sipping his tea with nervous hands. Yes, I used to run cables through there when I was younger. Dampness has always been present. It's a bit of a rat warren now. They sealed it up in 1972, I believe. Iron hatch with a bolt, Holmes sat forward. And would anyone today know how to access it? Addison smiled faintly. Only if they were present when we bricked it in. Unless they dug it out themselves. Holmes asked a few more questions, primarily about Grafton and his time with the stonemasons. Addison remembered him well, saying he was quiet, skilled with his hands, and preferred to work alone in the tower when performing repairs. As we departed, Holmes lit a cigarette and talked quietly. I wouldn't be surprised if Grafton carved out more than stone. We must check that trapdoor tonight. We returned to St. James's at dusk, this time with Reverend Calloway's hesitant blessing and the ring of keys that Holmes had requested earlier in the day. The church was empty except for the dim glow of oil lamps, and the silence was heavy, almost sacred. Holmes led the way along a short side aisle, comparing his map to the structure's interior. Finally, he came to a halt in front of a worn section of wainscoting at the base of the tower stairs. He knelt and scraped his fingernail across the floorboard. "Watson, your lantern," I handed it to him. He examined the floor seam before gently prodding its edge with a small brass tool. With a soft groan, the wood shifted, revealing a small, rusted iron handle that was barely visible unless one knew where to look. "Well," he said, almost cheerfully, "it appears Mr. Addison's memory serves him still." With some effort, the trapdoor opened, revealing a steep descent into darkness. Holmes descended first, lantern in hand, and I followed him into a space no wider than 3 feet. The walls were damp and lined with soot-blackened bricks. Cobwebs clung like old lace to the ceiling, and the air was rank with age and disuse. The passage turned sharply twice, then opened into a cramped chamber just below the bell tower's base. There, embedded into the wall, we found what we were looking for. A narrow copper pipe, newer than the surrounding structure, ran from a cavity in the stone upward toward the bell platform. Holmes examined it closely. "A transmission line," he muttered. "A harmonic tube, perhaps rigged with some kind of tuned striker. If one had the right frequency and a suitable impact, a man outside could cause just enough resonance to make the bell emit a single tone. Ingenious." He turned and ran his fingers along the floor, which was unnaturally clean. A dark stain clung to the stone in one corner, oil perhaps or polish. Then he found the box. It was wedged behind a loose slab, cleverly hidden. Inside were what looked like ledgers and several small parcels wrapped in cloth, each bearing the same stamped seal, a bell encircled by ivy. Holmes held one up. "Smuggling," he said softly. "Or something even more discreet. This chamber was a dead drop. The bell, its toll, was a signal that the hiding place was stocked, or that the coast was clear." He sifted through the ledgers. "These symbols aren't monetary. No values, but dates, many dates. And this one tonight." A chill ran through me. "You mean someone is coming?" "I expect so, and I believe it would be most educational to meet them." We resealed the chamber and took our positions that night. Holmes crouched in the shadows near the altar, I hidden beside a column just inside the transept. The church was silent as the grave. At 1:30 precisely there was a faint hum, so low it barely rose above silence, and then again. The bell tolled once, and this time we waited. At 1:40, the side gate creaked open. A figure entered, cloaked, gloved, moving without haste but with great purpose. He crossed the nave and headed directly toward the hidden panel. Holmes stepped forward, his voice sharp as a knife. "That will do, Mr. Grafton." The figure froze and then ran. Holmes moved with a speed that belied his usually measured manner, cutting across the nave in a blur of dark cloth and polished boots. I sprang from my own hiding place, heart thundering, and gave chase from the side. The intruder had a slight lead, but seemed to know the church's interior well. He didn't hesitate as he darted past the choir pews and into the chancel, his shadow flickering along the stained glass windows. He veered sharply left through a low door behind the pulpit, an access passage leading to the sacristy, and I nearly lost my footing navigating the tight turn. Holmes was already ahead of me, his voice ringing out in the stone corridor with that crisp authority that brooked no argument. "Stop, Grafton. You have nowhere to go." But the man did not stop. He ducked through the narrow door at the end of the corridor and vaulted down the stone steps that led into the undercroft, his boots striking the flagstones with startling force. I reached the stairs just as Holmes did, and together we plunged into the gloom beneath the church. The air was cooler there, thick with centuries-old dust and a slight odor of mildew. The intruder's lamp bounced ahead of us, casting wild shadows on the bricks. The light winked out with a harsh metallic clang. We waited for a second and listened. There was a barely audible scrape about 10 yards ahead. Holmes turned to me with a hushed voice. "He is hiding, probably behind one of the support pillars. The undercroft does not extend much further." I nodded, trying to see through the darkness. My pistol, which Holmes had recommended earlier, felt heavy at my side. He raised his voice steadily and confidently. "I'm Eli Grafton. You have been cornered. You still have the opportunity to speak up and be heard before the law takes action. But if you run again, remember that Scotland Yard is waiting just outside the vestry door." There was quiet. Then, slowly and reluctantly, a figure emerged from behind the central pillar. The man was older than I imagined, with a grey beard and a thin physique, as if suffering had gnawed away at him for years. However, his eyes were brilliant and watchful, filled with calculation. "So it is, Holmes," he replied gently. "I thought I saw you that night when the doorbell rang." "I convinced myself it couldn't be." "Then your instinct served you poorly," Holmes replied, moving closer, but not yet within reach. "Ingeniously, you rang that bell with your mind rather than your hand. But you gave yourself away the moment you returned to claim your treasures." Grafton turned to glance at the steps behind us before returning his gaze to Holmes. "You think you get it, but you don't. I did not return for what was hidden. I came because someone else did, someone who should not have known it existed." Holmes remained still. "You mean the cache had already been disturbed?" Grafton's expression changed, still wary but more urgent. "I arrived 2 nights ago. I didn't ring the doorbell, I was watching. Someone else did. Someone used the system I created, but not in the way I intended it. That signal, it was a summons, not a mark of delivery." My heart tightened. "A new player in your old operation?" He nodded slowly. "Perhaps one of the ones I never named. When the ring was broken, most were arrested, but there were others. I kept some secrets, too many perhaps." Holmes stepped forward now, calm but intense. "Then speak plainly, Grafton. Who else knew of the bell and the crawl space?" "A woman," he said. "A widow who worked the books. Name of Heloise Flint. She used to run a small seamstress shop near Clerkenwell, but did the accounts for the lot of us. Smart, discreet. When the ring fell apart, I thought she'd fled to the continent." "And you believe she's returned?" Holmes asked. "I don't know what to believe. Only that the bell rang, and it wasn't by my doing. The cache had been tampered with, and one of the old seals was replaced with a false mark. Something's been substituted. That's why I came back." Holmes turned away, thinking, "This changes the complexion of the case, Watson. We may not be chasing a ghost of the past, but an active deception in the present." Grafton raised his hands slightly, palms open. "I'll surrender if that's what you want. But I'm not the danger now. Whoever's using that bell, they've repurposed it. That means they're active, and worse, confident." Holmes gave him a long look, then gestured to me. "Watson, bind his hands. We'll take him to Lestrade. Then we pay a visit to Clerkenwell." Half an hour later, after turning Grafton over to the waiting inspector, Holmes and I made our way by cab through the narrow lanes of Clerkenwell. The seamstress's shop was easy enough to locate. A squat, weather-worn building with faded green shutters and a cracked window displaying lace doilies and children's mittens. Holmes didn't knock. He circled the building first, examining every drainpipe and shutter hinge, before finally lifting the latch and stepping inside. The bell above the door jangled, this one real and altogether more pedestrian. The interior was dim, quiet. Shelves of fabrics lined the walls, and a sewing machine sat beneath the rear window untouched. Dust lay thick upon the ledgers near the counter. "Closed for some time," Holmes murmured, "yet not abandoned." He moved toward the counter and pulled open the ledger, scanning the entries. "Last record dated 3 weeks ago. Odd. If she fled years ago, who's been keeping the books current?" I was about to respond when the front door creaked open behind us. A woman stood there, hat low over her brow, scarf pulled high around her throat. She froze upon seeing us, and for a heartbeat the room held its breath. Holmes, ever the master of tone, turned to her as though he were an expected visitor. "Miss Flint, I presume." She said nothing. Her hand, however, moved subtly to her coat, too subtly. "Please don't," Holmes said gently. "Dr. Watson here is armed, and we have little appetite for melodrama." Her hand stopped. "You're not police," she said finally. "No," Holmes answered. "But you know who I am. And you know why I'm here." She hesitated, then stepped inside and shut the door. "I didn't ring the bell," she said. "But I heard it. I've always kept the pattern written down. Old habits. You visited the church," Holmes stated. "You saw the cash, and you left your own mark. I needed what was in it. I thought I was the only one left." Holmes's expression did not soften. "Then tell me, what did you take? And who else did you alert?" She met his gaze for the first time. There was no malice in it, only weariness. "Holmes, what I took wasn't gold or ledgers. It was insurance, names, proof. Evidence I never turned over to the authorities. Someone else wants it destroyed. And now they know it's missing," Holmes concluded. She nodded slowly. "And they'll come for it. Maybe for me." Holmes's voice was low, cold. "Then we set a second trap. But this time the bell will not ring for them. It will ring for us." Holmes turned from the woman and paced once through the small shop, his gloved fingers trailing lightly along the counter, tapping once against a spool of white thread. The room had grown still again, thick with tension, though no one dared move or speak. He came to rest at the window, where a smudge of lamplight painted fractured shadows across the lace curtains. His silhouette was almost spectral against the soft glow, but his voice, when it came, was crisp and deliberate. "You said you took the evidence, Miss Flint, but not for profit. Then why now? What changed after all these years?" She paused. Her shoulders rose slightly, as though to steel herself. "A letter," she said at last. "No return address. Just one line inside. It said, 'The bell tolls again.'" "You are not safe." Holmes turned back. "And you interpreted this as a threat." "I interpreted it as a warning," she said evenly. "That someone had rediscovered the system we built. Or perhaps that someone never forgot it at all. And so you returned to the cache to retrieve your safeguard," Holmes informed us. "I assumed it would be undamaged. I hadn't gone there in nearly 6 years. But when I unsealed the seal, I discovered that it had been disturbed. One ledger was missing. That's how I knew someone had already joined the game." Holmes furrowed his brow. "And you didn't report this? To whom, Mr. Holmes? What about the police, Lestrade?" "I have no illusions about how far their reach extends. You and I both know that there are names in those ledgers that would cause a magistrate to hesitate. I came forward, unable to maintain silence. And yet you retained this knowledge, even when men like Grafton went free while others served time in his place." Her glance switched to me, unabashed but not without meaning. "I kept it because it was the only leverage I had. Insurance, as Holmes mentioned. And now someone has come to get it." Holmes, who had returned to his seat, folded his arms and closed his eyes for a while. "There is a pattern here," he explained carefully. "Someone rung the bell, using Grafton's system, not to bring forth the old smuggling ring, but to entice anyone who might have understood its secrets." Grafton replied. "You replied. That leaves the originator as the only shrouded figure." Miss Flint shifted uneasily. "I'm not sure who it could be." Grafton was intelligent, but he kept to himself. "The others in the ring who weren't apprehended vanished." Holmes opened his eyes. "Unless one of them has never left. And unless the bell's toll served as more than a signal. It could have been a provocation. An invitation to draw out the loose threads." The quiet fell, thick and uneasy. I could feel Holmes's mind rushing, flying from link to connection as quickly as a hawk over thermals. Finally he stood. "We must return to St. James," he remarked. "Tonight the bell must ring again. But this time under our conditions." Miss Flint's eyes widened. "Do you want to ring it more deliberately?" "I want to control the narrative," he explained. "Whoever has taken the missing ledger will want to make sure they are the only one left with secrets. If they feel another page might have been retrieved, they'll return to assure silence. And if they bring more than silence with them?" I asked grimly. Holmes grinned slightly. "Then they shall find more than shadows in the dark." We returned to the chapel just after midnight. Lestrade, whom Holmes had given word to earlier, waited inside with 2 constables stationed discreetly at the transept doors. Holmes had only chosen guys he could trust, quiet, watchful and unlikely to panic. Miss Flint, dressed in a dark shawl and heavy coat, stood near the altar, holding a folded page in her gloved hand, one of Holmes's ledger copies. Holmes had instructed her to serve as bait, which she accepted with calm confidence, though I noticed a tremble in her fingers as she took her seat near the back benches. The air in the nave was moist and stuffy, with the aroma of wax and stone. Holmes positioned himself in the shadows behind the choir loft, while I crouched behind a tall candle stand near the center aisle, where I could see both the trapdoor and the vestry door in one glance. At precisely 1:30, Holmes silently walked through the corridor to the base of the bell tower. I heard a quiet click from the mechanism he had built, a precise, purposeful activation of the resonant copper wire. A moment later, the great bell struck a single, sonorous toll. Its resonance permeated the church like a pulse through bone. Then we waited. The hush returned thicker than before, imbued with expectation. Several minutes passed. Then I heard it, the quiet scratch of metal on wood. It's the side gate again. Someone was approaching. Holmes appeared beside me in the shadows. He did not speak, but his gaze shifted to the aisle. A figure entered, tall, cloaked, face obscured by the collar of a coat and the shadow of a hat. He went purposefully, but not hastily, as if rehearsing steps he had already performed several times. He walked past Miss Flint without a glance. She remained completely still, her hand frozen on the pew rail. He crouched near the trapdoor and reached for the floorboards. Drawing a long, narrow blade from his coat, Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Caro," he said softly. "I wondered when you would come." The man froze. Holmes continued with a steady voice. "You were always the quiet person, the bookkeeper's apprentice, the individual who transported the ledgers to and from the safe house. You were never charged, never even questioned, because you hid in plain sight." Caro slowly straightened, holding the sword in his hand. "You shouldn't have rung the bell again," he said. "It was meant to stay buried." "And yet you rang it first," Holmes said. "To see who would return." Caro's face contorted and his voice sounded bitter. The others became greedy. Flint hoarded the names while Grafton hid the profits. "I only ever want silence, peace, but they couldn't let it go." Holmes inched closer, step by slow step. "So you came tonight to ensure your secrets remained just that." Caro tightened his grasp on the knife. "It was never meant to be this way." Lestrade appeared behind him, gun drawn. "Drop it, Caro. Now." The blade hit the stone with a clatter. Lestrade and his crew arrested him without incident. Caro said little after that, just that he'd listened to the bell's toll from the shadows, confident that someone would return for the ultimate secret. And when they did, he intended to be waiting. Holmes remained silent for a long time after Caro was carried away. He stood before the altar with his hands behind his back, watching the dim light flicker across the stained glass windows as morning broke. Miss Flint stood beside him, silent and worn. "It's over then," she said. Holmes offered a slight nod. "For now." However, secrets like these rarely evaporate completely. They lie in wait like the echo of a bell that no one hears until it rings again. I stepped forward, tired but relieved. "And the cash?" "Destroyed," Holmes replied gently, "as it should have been years ago." Outside, the first birds had begun to sing tentatively in the dreary morning air. Holmes turned away from the altar. "Come, Watson. I think we have just enough time for breakfast before the papers arrive, and I believe this morning's headline rings a bell of its own." We left the church just as the gas lamps flickered out down Highbury Street, and the morning sun shed a slight warmth on the flagstones. The morning mist clung to the city like a final curtain, unwilling to leave after a night filled with secrets. Holmes was unusually silent as we rode back to Baker Street, his eyes unfocused, not from exhaustion, but from the intensity of a mind still working. He didn't say anything until the tea was poured, and the door was securely closed behind Mrs. Hudson. I dislike incomplete patterns. "Watson," he murmured finally, peering at the steam above his cup. "Caro's confession, sincere though it may be, lacks one essential detail, which is why he waited." I looked up from the paper that I had started to unroll. "He said he wanted peace, that he was afraid the cash would reveal him." Holmes shook his head with a hint of anger. "Yes, but examine the timeline. He was familiar with the system. He had access. Nonetheless, for nearly 6 years, he did nothing. Not till this week. What changed? I pondered for a time, but no response revealed itself. Holmes stood and proceeded to his desk, opening his notepad to reveal a precise diagram of the church, bell tower, and hidden crawl space. Caro did not come back for peace. He returned for the ledger. Not to destroy, but to locate it. That suggests he didn't accept it in the first place. I straightened, instantly aware. Then who did? Holmes's finger tapped the page's margin. That's the thread we missed. Caro replied to the bell with fear. But someone called it first, someone who knew how. And someone who wished to provoke the others. The letter Flint received, I explained slowly. You think that was from someone other than Caro? I believe it almost likely was. In fact, I believe it was sent by the person who removed the original ledger a few weeks ago. He turned back to face the flames. Fingers pushed together. Grafton, Flint, Caro. A signal was used to attract everyone back into the web. Everyone was looking for a remembrance of a secret they thought was long forgotten. But the true puppeteer remained in the shadows. He let them converge before taking a step back to observe. And you think he's still watching? I think, Holmes replied softly. He's preparing to act again. We were interrupted just then by a knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, looking bewildered. A small youngster comes to see you, Mr. Holmes. From the district messenger office. The kid entered, doffing his cap and giving Holmes a small sealed package. Holmes handed him a coin without looking up, already ripping the seal. The note was brief, typed on a tiny piece of paper. You missed one, midnight, St. James's, alone. Holmes read it twice and handed it to me. Typed, I replied. No signature, and delivered through the messengers rather than by post, according to Holmes. Our man is cautious. However, the note tells me two things. First, he is confident. Second, he believes the game is not yet over. You don't mean to go alone, he grinned slightly. Certainly not. But he expects me to, which is why we have to make it appear as if I do. The afternoon was spent in calm preparation. Holmes spoke privately with Lestrade, requesting that a plainclothes squad be stationed discreetly around the perimeter of St. James's before midnight. I was supposed to remain hidden in the crawlspace, with a clear view of the trapdoor chamber beneath the bell. Despite Holmes's protests, Miss Flint insisted on returning as well, arguing, correctly, that her presence would bring out the final player. Holmes agreed, if hesitantly. By 11 o'clock the church was once again silent. The benches remained silent beneath the flickering gas sconces, and the enormous bell loomed above, as if waiting to speak again. Holmes arrived just as the last of the constables had taken their positions, entering through the vestry alone, as the note had specified. He wore a basic overcoat and hat, and didn't carry a cane or backpack. From the outside he appeared to be a solitary guy, responding to a summons in the dark. Inside, we observed. Minutes passed. Midnight struck. There's no bell this time. No signal. Then a faint creak. From the apse, a side door gradually opened. A man stepped through, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy wool coat with his hat brim pulled low. Holmes stood calmly at the altar rail and did not turn. The man approached slowly, his footsteps echoing across the tiled floor. You came, he murmured softly and unhurriedly. Good. I hoped you would. Holmes eventually turned. And who precisely have I come to meet? The man removed his hat, revealing a pale, angular face with close-cropped hair that had turned silver at the temples. His face was strange, almost clinical. You may call me Ashford, he said. Although it's a moniker I no longer use professionally. There are too many memories. Holmes lifted his eyebrow. Ashford. I remember that name from the original trial documents. You were a financier, minor companion in the ring, absconded during the hearings. I was never arrested, Ashford explained quietly. I had leverage, and I had foresight. I knew the others would fold. You were the one who took the ledger, Holmes explained. Weeks ago, Ashford smiled. Yes, I needed to see who was left, who might still pose a risk. I didn't intend to keep the cash, you realize? I just needed to shake the tree, and now that you've seen who falls from it, I noticed that some old ghosts still believe in atonement. Others maintain silence. However, the ones who matter, the dangerous ones, have been lured into the light. That was my goal. Holmes' expression did not change. Why call me? Because even I have my limits, Ashford explained. And somebody else was watching. Someone not from the previous ring. A new face. I discovered proof of tampering that I did not cause. I'd never seen the pages that were removed. That's why I need you. Holmes' voice sounded quieter now. So the hunter has become the hunted. Ashford nodded. I fear a new ring is developing, one based on the architecture we abandoned. And this one might not be smuggling silk or trinkets. There was movement in the back of the chapel. Holmes's gaze shifted briefly to the shadows beyond the pews. You brought no one with you? No, but it appears that we were both followed. Another figure entered from the side entrance, smaller and faster. A gun went off and Ashford staggered back, holding his shoulder. Holmes raced forward as the second guy raised his pistol again, but Lestrade took him down with a smashing shove from the shadows. Chaos erupted. 2 constables charged forward. The would-be assassin battled fiercely, but the battle ended quickly. Ashford, bleeding but aware, leaned against the altar rail and breathed heavily. I warned you, he said hoarsely. There is another player. He doesn't care about secrets. Only profit. Holmes knelt alongside him and examined the wound. Then we will find him, but not with half-truths. You will tell me everything, Ashford. Every name, each ledger, every passage you left behind. Ashford scowled and nodded once the bell. Above stayed still, but below, in the shadows of that old cathedral, a new scheme had begun, and Holmes, ever the sentinel, was already following its trail. By the time we arrived at the vicar's office at the back of St. James, Ashford's coat was completely soaked in blood. Lestrade had already summoned a physician, who would arrive in minutes, but Holmes would not spend any more time. The door was closed, the curtains shut, and Ashford, pale and gritting his teeth, was slumped in the chair beneath a stained-glass image of St. Peter. Holmes crouched before him, not unkindly, but with that steady, unwavering gaze I'd come to recognize as the start of his ultimate dive into the core of a riddle. You will survive, Holmes remarked. The shot went cleanly through the shoulder. A courtesy wound, not an execution. That tells me your attacker meant more than just silence. A message, perhaps? Ashford grimaced as he exhaled through his nose. He was one of mine. Not like the old days. Hired muscle. I thought I could trust him. Holmes's voice became sharper. So your enemies have already infiltrated your own circle. You must talk now while the details are still fresh. Start with the ledgers. How many did you take? 3, Ashford said hoarsely. I found 3 ledgers in the stash beneath the tower. 1 I burned. The names were too small to matter. The 2nd I used to entice Flint and Carrow. But the 3rd I retained. And the pages missing from that 3rd? Gone before I arrived, he said. Torn clean. 30 pages, perhaps more. Whoever arrived first knew exactly what they were wanted. They accepted transactions, not just names. Holmes's face clouded. Financial trends, routes, dates. So it's not just easy blackmail, infrastructure. A blueprint, Ashford gave one nod. I believe someone intends to resurrect the system. Smuggling, yes, but not in the same way. Less velvet and jewelry, more volatile. Explosives? I inquired, stepping forward. Or arms, Holmes replied calmly. And St. James's is still linked to the original tunnels. Not sealed. Not really. I knew it as soon as I spotted the pipes beneath the nave. That bell tower was never designed to store sound alone. Ashford moved, his breath quickening. I attempted to stop it. That is why I phoned you. I wasn't a saint, Holmes, but I never sold war. Holmes stood. His gaze searched the room before falling on a map of the parish pinned to the far wall. He walked over to it, scrutinizing the layout quietly, one finger tracing a line from the church to a thick cluster of buildings in Clerkenwell. Have any of the tunnels collapsed? He inquired. Ashford shakes his head. Only 2 were ever bricked. The others were left alone after the trial. Nobody thought to dig deeper. Holmes' lips pulled together in a tight line. Then someone else has. They've traced the original arteries of the ring and twisted them into something considerably more lethal. Lestrade entered just then, his coat soaked from the dampness outdoors. The shooter's unconscious, he stated. He isn't saying anything right now, but we discovered a list of dates in his coat pocket. Tomorrow is marked, underlined twice. Holmes turned. Let me see it. Lestrade handed it over. Holmes scanned the small folded piece, which was written in tight graphite lettering, dates, initials, locations, and a name, St. Bartholomew's docks entry, Tuesday at 2 a.m. Holmes looked up. That is the old tunnel entrance, beneath the church. It connects directly to the east dock by way of 2 kilometers of bricked tunnel and a hatch beneath the foundation of the old hospital. Lestrade frowned. But that entrance was sealed years ago. Not sealed, neglected, and now repurposed. Watson, get your coat. I didn't have to ask. I was already moving. We arrived at the docks around 1:30, having commandeered an unmarked cab and followed a route Holmes said would avoid notice. The area was dormant, blanketed in fog that clung to every gaslight and corner, like a thick wool blanket. The tunnel beneath St. Bartholomew's was hidden behind an old stone gatehouse that had long been deactivated, with shattered windows and a half-collapsed roof. Holmes led us through with the precision of a cartographer, unlocking a corroded door with a key he said was on loan from the diocese archives. Inside, the hallway yawned in front of us, a tight, frigid artery of brick and soil with a damp, uneven floor. Holmes lighted his lantern and we fell. The tunnel was tiny, barely large enough for 2 men to pass, and the air smelt of damp coal and rust. For 10 minutes we walked silently, the only sounds being the regular drip of old water and the faint scrape of our boots. Then Holmes paused. Listen. It was weak but distinctive. Her scraping sound, metal against stone. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood in complete darkness. Footsteps. Someone was approaching from the far end. The rhythm was unhurried, possibly a single man dragging something behind him. Then a tiny click, the distinct sound of a case being unlatched. Holmes whispered, "Arms shipment." Or worse. I leaned in. "Shall we wait?" He shook his head in the darkness. "No, we make an interception, now." He moved quickly and softly through the tunnel and I followed. As we reached the bend, the light from a small torch ahead formed figures on the wall, 3 men crouching alongside a long wooden container. Someone lifted the lid, inside straw and oilcloth with tall black barrels glinting in the lamplight. Holmes moved forward, his voice quiet but cutting through the darkness like a razor. "Gentlemen, I believe you have lost your way. This is not your typical port of call." The nearest man reached for his hip. Holmes was faster, his gun already drawn. "Don't." They froze. Lestrade and his men, whom Holmes had asked to follow discreetly, arrived at the rear entrance and sealed off the escape. The smugglers were apprehended without further struggle. Among them was a name Holmes subsequently discovered to be associated with a political faction, suspected of smuggling weaponry through neutral ports. Hours later, Holmes returned to Baker Street and sat by the fire, hands folded beneath his chin. I poured us both a brandy, breaking the silence with the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. "Do you think it's over?" I asked. He took a sip before responding. "No, however, the bell is no longer ringing for the time being." I leaned back. "The tunnel system will be sealed finally. Ashford's ledgers will fill up the gaps. I believe Miss Flint will vanish again. Grafton possibly too." He glanced at the flames. "But remember, Watson, systems never really die. They slumber. Until someone figures out how to make the bell ring again." I nodded. And we went a long time without saying anything, and somewhere beyond the morning sun, London sighed, unconscious that the enormous machine of its underbelly had altered. Quieted but not stopped. By the time London came to life under a pewter sky, Holmes had vanished inside his study. I found him there an hour after morning, sleeves rolled, cravat discarded, breakfast scraps undisturbed next to a growing stack of papers. His unplayed violin rested against the armchair, indicating that his mind was completely focused. When I walked in, he didn't glance up, and instead nodded to the map laying across his desk. I've traced 3 of the drop points listed in Ashford's stolen ledger, according to him. All overlap with established black market trading zones, 2 on the Limehouse docks and 1 in Paddington Basin. None were employed throughout the old ring's functioning. This suggests that the new faction has already started digging new passageways. I approached him, scanning the inked notes and lines. "And the shipment we intercepted in the tunnel? I assume it's a deception, or only one cell in a larger organization. The way they moved, quiet, precise, and confident. It was not a test. It was a routine." He finally caught my eye. "We have exposed the bell tower, yes. However, the mechanism behind it continues to function." I knew then that Holmes would not let this go, not with new tunnels operating under the old code, nor with weapons sliding through the city like river mist. The danger was no longer a riddle to be solved. It had become dynamic, spreading, and insidious. Lestrade came before midday, his face wrinkled from lack of sleep, but his coat dry, indicating that he had travelled by cab and had not remained at Scotland Yard. "They've cracked the name of the man with the pistol," he announced without hesitation. "He goes by Callum Vey, born in Liverpool, dockside upbringing. There are no priors, although he is known to a couple of our personnel who have worked in maritime patrol. He spent time abroad, smuggling industrial tools through colonial ports." Holmes simply nodded, unsurprised. "A courier, then. Likely recruited to manage the shipment and tie up any loose ends." Lestrade handed over a lightweight file tied in twine. "We also found this among his belongings. Handwritten ledger entries. Some use strange abbreviations." Holmes untied the file and studied its contents silently. I watched as his brow furrowed. "Not currency," he muttered. "These are not payments. These are times, intervals." I leaned over his shoulder. "Intervals for what?" Holmes looked up, his expression gloomy. "Bell tolls." Lestrade straightened. "You think they're using the sound itself as part of the system?" "Aye. I believe someone has developed a technique of communicating that is invisible to the inexperienced sight. Regular tolls, non-patterned, sometimes happening days apart, but timed to precise hours of the night." "You mean coded signals?" Holmes tapped the page. "Precisely. Delivered not by letter or courier, but by the bell itself. A toll pattern that is timing-specific rather than number-specific. A messaging system that is easily detectable." I looked between them. "But the bell has been disconnected." We watched it. "The clapper has not moved since." Holmes strode to the fireplace, arms folded. "We assumed the resonance mechanism was a gimmick, created by Caro for convenience. What if it was more than that? What if they discovered a way to use ambient vibration, an unknown mechanism? A resonant pulse that is triggered at a distance. Not merely a meeting reminder, but also a piece of data." Lestrade swore under his breath. "You mean they've turned a church bell into a telegraph line?" Holmes gave a firm nod. "Sound travels. Vibrations linger. A strike at a specific hour, amplified through hidden cavities, might provide a distinct signal. If the structure is sensitive enough and the listener is taught, they will understand exactly what is meant." I felt a cold run through me. "Then the church is more than just a symbol. It is infrastructure. And the man or woman operating this operation," Holmes continued softly, "is not just a smuggler. They're an architect. Someone is rebuilding an empire under the city's feet." We sat with that knowledge for a long time, each hearing the same echo in our minds. The quiet toll of the bell, not as an omen, but as a language. Holmes returned to his desk and unrolled a new map, one I had not seen before. It had no names, just exquisite contour lines drawn by hand. "These," he explained, "are acoustic overlays. Research into how vibration transmits through antique stone constructions. I took them years ago while working on a case involving an art forger who stored stolen canvases in cathedral vaults." He pointed to St. James's bell tower, which is marked in red. "There are 5 other churches built with the same limestone foundation and undercroft structure, all within 3 miles. I caught on right away. Each could carry the same signal, or host the same mechanism," Holmes explained. "And if so, the network is larger than we thought." Lestrade came forward. "Give me their names. I will have them watched." Holmes had already scribbled, "St. Swithin's is located in Clerkenwell. All Saints near Bethnal Green. St. Giles's in Cripplegate. St. Augustine's, which is no longer in use, is located immediately off Old Street. Finally, there's St. Jude's on the canal." Lestrade's eyes narrowed as he perused the list. "St. Jude's was closed last year. There is no staff. No clergy. Then it's the most dangerous of the 5, Holmes replied. "There's no one to watch. There's no one to listen. Just echoes." We arranged to meet again that night, taking various routes to St. Jude's. Lestrade would have his men stationed nearby, dressed as dock workers and sellers. Holmes, with his signature subtlety, would pose as a drunken beggar slumped beneath the canal bridge opposite the church. I was to pose as a charity worker, assessing the disused church for prospective repair, a ploy Holmes had already planned with falsified documents from a fictional parish council. Night descended cold and slowly. The streets surrounding St. Jude's were dead, and the chapel itself stood like a stone carcass. Its windows were soot-black, and its doors were chained yet easily accessed. I obtained entry through the rear garden wall, which was originally used for parish gatherings, but is now overrun with thistles and broken benches. Inside, the air was thick with mould and moist soot. My lantern casts uneven shadows across the nave. The altar was unadorned. The pews were rotten. The bell tower loomed above me, visible only through a crack in the rafters. I made my way towards it, taking care not to alarm any hidden presences. The stairs was partially collapsed, but a tiny ladder remained trapped in the corner. Someone had been here recently. I climbed it, emerged into the chamber above, and then froze. A machine stood in the center of the area, tucked beneath the bell itself. It was sleek, metal, and modern. A mounted coil of copper wire hummed softly. It came with a tuning fork assembly, and what appeared to be a wind-up clock gadget, programmed to trigger the fork at a specified hour. I crouched to check the instrument. It was rudimentary but effective. By striking the fork against a spring-loaded chamber, the vibrations were magnified upward into the bell's base. Not ringing the bell, but whispering through it. Then I heard footsteps on the floor beneath. A numerical value has been entered. Dressed in black, slow and deliberate. I pressed hard against the beam and held my breath. They approached the machine, inspected the dials, and turned a small lever. Then they spoke only 2 words, "Tomorrow night." The figure turned and descended again. I waited until the footsteps faded into silence. Only then did I let myself breathe. I descended rapidly, met Holmes at the canal's edge, and reported what I had observed. His eyes blazed with odd joy. "Excellent," he replied. "They have disclosed the hour. Now all that remains," he turned to face the distant horizon, "is to make them believe the bell has spoken back." Holmes's voice was no more than a murmur, yet it held a weight that appeared to descend over the misted canal, like a curtain falling at the end of a play. "They've set an hour, Watson. And now we will respond directly, decisively, and in kind." We stood in quiet beneath the arch of the old footbridge, the cold seeping through the stones and into our boots. I didn't understand what Holmes was up to, but the flare of intensity in his eyes told me he was already planning the shadows before the actors came. Back at Baker Street, as dawn pressed against the window panes and Mrs. Hudson set about her quiet clatter of tea things below, Holmes took to the floor. He began sketching a diagram on 3 pieces of parchment, using chalk and a compass, the size of the bell tower, the resonance range, and the machine's striking radius. He made computations aloud, muttering to himself, decibels, cycles, and delay thresholds, terms that flew over my head but rang true. "Watson," he replied without turning, "the device you saw was designed to receive confirmation rather than just signal. You believe it listens for a response?" "More accurately," he responded, "it anticipates one. A secondary tone with a slightly offset frequency. It is the oral equivalent of a password, broadcast into the air, and if correctly received, activates the next link in the chain. Whoever organized this wants to know they are not alone. They need validation before they can move forward." I stared at him. "Then if we answer it, we misled them. We tell them what they want to hear, and then we grab them when they arrive." He stood abruptly, the chalk still between his fingers. "However, it must be perfect. The resonance must meet their expectations. If the tone is off by even a fraction, they will know the system has been compromised. They will vanish. Can we replicate it?" "So with the proper instruments, certainly. We must return to St. Jude's tonight. Quietly. I'll need to examine the coil, record its pitch, and measure the interval. And then we create our own. Another machine?" Holmes shakes his head. "No, this would take weeks. I'll use my violin," I blinked. "Your violin?" He smiled faintly. "There is no purer transmitter of vibration. Its tone can be modulated with complete control. All I need is to know what frequency the tuning fork was set to. From there I can mimic the pitch with a bow and string, and we can communicate via the bell." That evening, we found ourselves again beneath the cracked timbers of St. Jude's. Lestrade's men had sealed off the streets surrounding the church, posing as municipal workers, tending to gas mains and telegraph lines. Holmes climbed the belfry in silence, his tools slung in a leather case, and we didn't say anything for over an hour, except for the faint tapping and tuning that came from above. Finally he descended, face pale and focused, and unwrapped his violin case beneath the nave's broken rose window. "The coil strikes at 422 hertz, he explained. "It is a near violin A, but a little sharper. Intentional, I believe, to avoid inadvertent reproduction. Fortunately, I'm familiar with that variety. Paganini utilized it in a darker composition, the B minor Adagio. He carefully tightened the pegs, adjusted the bridge, and rosined the bow. Every movement conveyed an almost priestly devotion. When I begin, he added, I'll play exactly 4 bars. The final note must continue through the bell's chamber and return to itself. We will wait and see when it happens. And if it doesn't, he looked up, his eyes bright. Then we start again, until the bell speaks back. I said nothing as he raised the bow, took a breath, and began playing. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before. Hollow, almost sorrowful, but intensely concentrated. It echoed out into the belfry and into the building's bones, seeping through masonry and stone, until the bell above it caught the tone and began to hum. Not loudly, not toll-like, but with a trembling, ghostly resonance. The note floated in the air, supported not by human hands, but by building itself. Holmes let the final stroke drop into quiet. We waited, too. Minutes 5-10, a slight mechanical click echoed up from below. Holmes smiled. They accepted it. We exited the chapel without speaking, emerging into the starlit darkness as if from a crypt. Holmes's speed quickened with each block we passed, his limbs suddenly coming to life after hours in the cold. Now, he added as we returned to the Strand, they'll send someone. A courier, perhaps. Or an auditor. Someone should check the system's integrity. And you intend to intercept them? Better, he responded. We shall let them walk straight into the open and believe themselves unseen. The next night was clear, windless, and cold enough to keep even the regular drunks off the river path. Lestrade had stationed men on nearby rooftops, 2 more in a delivery cart on the South Road, and 1 dressed as a lamplighter at the foot of the canal bridge. Holmes and I waited in the gloomy church's gallery, looking through the round oculus in the upper wall. At precisely 1:45, a figure emerged from the east, this time a woman, tall, hooded, with a fast and confident walk. She went under the bridge, circled the gatehouse remains, and approached the bell tower door. Holmes did not move. She unlocked it. Then, without looking around, she entered and closed the door behind her. Holmes lifted his hand. 1 sharp gesture. Lestrade moved. Within seconds, the woman was apprehended, disarmed, and led beneath the apse. Her face, once revealed, seemed familiar. Flint, but not Miss Heloise Flint, her niece. Holmes stepped forward. I had wondered, he explained. Your aunt was clever. However, she would never have returned to the city without protection. Nor did she leave her system so open. You followed her. I watched her. I took the ledger before she did. The young woman, no older than 25, returned his gaze coldly. She was weak, she explained. She believed in secrecy. I believe in systems. You built this signal relay. She nodded once. She told me everything following the trial. Taught me the codes, caches, and timings. However, she never grasped the concept of scale. She buried stuff. I resurrected them. Holmes' voice sounded like flint. And to what end? Arms? Trade in blood and steel. Influence, she replied simply. When the bells ring, everyone moves. That is power. And I aim to control it. Holmes gazed at Lestrade. She's an architect. Arrest her. She smiled as the cuffs were tightened around her wrists. You've only heard the first bell, Mr. Holmes. There are others. Deeper. Holmes held her stare for a long time. Then he stepped back and said nothing else. Outside, the stars twinkled over the rooftops. But far below, in the forgotten veins of London, the stone still trembled softly with the echo of a note struck not by wind nor rope, but by human will. And Holmes, despite the game was finishing, stayed listening, for silence, or till the next bell. At morning, Baker Street was completely silent, except for the ticking of Holmes's long case clock and the muffled hiss of the kettle. I sat at the table, reflecting on the events of the previous 4 days, with the sad realization that we had not reached an end, only a postponement. Holmes stood immobile at the window, silhouetted against the misted glass. His violin rested on the settee, the bow still strung. He hadn't touched it since the capture at St. Jude's. I suspected the notes lingered in his memory, suspended like a whisper he couldn't escape. Did you believe her? I inquired at last. Flint's niece. Holmes did not move. I trusted in her ambition, her precision, and her pride. What about the others? Are there more? He finally turned, but his expression was neither triumphant nor satisfied. Only computation, almost certainly. Her system was never intended to be centralized. There is no single point of failure. She mentioned scale, Watson. And scale necessitates delegation. I leaned forwards. Cells? Independent, autonomous, trained to operate under silence until activated. He moved to the mantel and placed one hand on it. Yet her confidence failed her. She let herself oversee the confirmation signal personally. That implies either hubris or fear. You think someone was behind her. I believe someone built her, trained her. I gave her the principles. She had the intelligence, yes, but not the wherewithal to build such infrastructure in isolation. She was a student. The question is, of whom? I rose and handed him a second cup of tea. You claimed she talked about influence. Power is obtained by motion. When the bell rings, people move. Holmes nodded slowly and stared into the steam. It's not just her idea, he remarked. For ages, bells have been used to summon, warn, and divide. It is a psychological trigger. This ring, this new one, is based on that premise. A network formed by tone, vibration, and expectancy. The command is not spoken. It is heard. I thought about it and then sat down again. Where do we begin? Holmes did not respond quickly. He walked to his desk, unlocked the top drawer, and took out the confiscated list discovered on the courier's body, the one with the handwritten dates, intervals, and locations. He lay it flat and motioned for me to get closer. Look here, he instructed. Each record identifies a church or tunnel location, followed by an abbreviation and time. Now compare these to the acoustic overlays we looked at 2 nights ago. I leaned in. They match, precisely. What's more telling is what's absent. There's a 3-week delay between the second and third entry. There are no bells, no movements. A delay in shipments? No, a halt in signals. A blackout window. I checked it against the city's cargo logs. There were no unexpected arrivals at that time. However, the next week 4 shipments were tagged for private holding corporations at the Limehouse Basin. Shell firms. 2 of them have subsequently been liquidated. 1 transferred ownership to an Amsterdam party. Someone tested the system, I said softly. Then they used it. Holmes nodded. If we hadn't interfered, the next wave would have gone unreported. A chain of cargo, all guided by rhythm alone. I sat back, relaxed. Can we trace it back? That, Holmes explained, is the next stage. But we must be cautious. Flint's niece wasn't a founder, but rather an operator. The originator stays in shadow, and he will be aware that his pupil has been silenced. There came a strong and urgent knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, visibly upset. A note to Mr. Holmes, I just delivered. No return address. Holmes accepted it with a nod, broke the seal and read quietly. He then held it out to me. The handwriting was narrow and angular. St. Giles rang out at 4. However, no one showed up. Was that your doing? Holmes folded the note without saying anything and tossed it into the fire. It's begun, he stated simply. Who sent it? The one above Flint, possibly the real architect. They've sent a message, but it's not a threat yet. But I have a question, a probe. They suspect intervention, but they're not sure. And if they become certain, Holmes looked at me squarely. Then they'll change the pattern, and we'll lose the melody completely. He paced the floor in short arcs, brow wrinkled. I must return to St. Giles. Alone. Tonight. If the message is legitimate, they may send a follow-up. If we're lucky, they'll ring again, but this time I'll be listening from within. I stepped forward. You mustn't go without protection. I must remain unseen, Watson. They will vanish as soon as they sense they are being observed. But I want you at St. Augustine's. The bell is tuned to the same harmonic range. If there is a cascading signal, it will continue through that node. He briefly placed his hand on my shoulder. And Watson, if I do not respond by daybreak, you are to carry my notes to Lestrade, each page, and instruct him to seal the undercroft of all limestone foundations from here to Poplar. You expect danger. I demand a strategy. And I plan to interrupt it. That evening, Holmes left under a false identity, cloaked and stooped like a vagabond priest, with only a pitch pipe, a tuning fork, and a roll of transcribed frequencies. I arrived at St. Augustine's an hour later, concealed in the rubble of the sacristy, the bell tower visible through the shattered arch above me. I brought only Holmes's notes and a lamp, which I kept covered with a cloth. Midnight has passed, then 1, still nothing. Then, Faintly and almost imperceptibly, a low moan of metal stirred, not from my tower, from his, one toll, then another, uneven, deliberate. I held my breath, attempting to decipher the code Holmes outlined. It was not a summons, it was a challenge, a sequence intended to elicit a response. Then came the third toll, and I knew the pattern. It was the same call Holmes had answered with his violin. A imitation. A test, then quiet. I didn't move, I waited. A full hour has gone finally. 4 bells from the east unknown, too fast. Too sharp. A malfunction in the system. A new frequency. I jotted it down in the dark. Holmes hadn't returned it. They rang again and he chose not to answer. Or worse, I rose immediately, got the bills and dashed down the street. My pulse pounding. Holmes may have played a deeper game than he revealed to me, or the bell had been stolen again, and this time, by someone who didn't want to be heard at all. The carriage arrived at Baker Street shortly after 7, its wheels slippery from the early rain. I hadn't slept. The note I had given to Lestrade had already been sent, and the inspector's men were moving to the locations Holmes had identified weeks before. Still, I couldn't get any rest. The silence in the sitting room was oppressive without him. I turned when I heard the sound of the key in the door. He arrived cautiously, wet through, with a cut across his temple and one sleeve ripped at the seam. But he remained upright, and his eyes, exhausted as they were, burned with clear determination. "Watson," he simply said, "we have them." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "You disappeared." "I thought I had to," he explained, immediately removing his coat. "They required proof. Silence is the sole currency in their society. I gave them mine. I helped him into a dry towel, but he still struggled to follow. You let them believe you had been taken?" He offered a slight nod. "They contacted me after the second toll. A test. I reacted incorrectly on purpose, half-tone sharp. They assumed a system break and began to evacuate. I followed. You were inside their network?" "For a single night," he said. "But enough." Finally, he sat down and unwrapped a parcel from his coat. Inside was a sheet adorned with sigils and timestamps, frequency signatures, and transfer notations. Everything Flint's niece had promised and more. But Holmes held one last item, a little brass key. He held it up with 2 fingers. "This," he explained, "opens a trapdoor in the old St. Swithin's Tower. A subterranean room was erected beneath it during the restorations following the Great Fire. It houses the final receiver, which controls the complete relay system." I just stared. "Then it wasn't St. James's that anchored the system at all?" "No," he replied. "That was a deception. The true heart of it remained dormant until last night. When the final sequence of 4 unfamiliar bells sounded out, it was not a call. It was an erasure. A shutdown code. The mastermind knew they had been compromised, and they tried to bury the system for good. But not before you got to it." "Just so," Holmes replied. "Inside the receiver, I discovered a list of names, aliases, and false credentials used to fund the network. Several people point to foreign embassies. One belongs to a Trieste-based maritime syndicate. This was not a smuggling ring, Watson. It was an experiment. A silent command approach that tests the extent to which compliance can be communicated just through rhythm. And who was behind it?" Holmes's voice sank. "We may never fully understand. However, I suppose Flint's niece was correct in one aspect. She wasn't the architect. She was the result. Someone had trained her, conditioned her, possibly from childhood. They created a disciple, not an heir." He stood and approached the fire. "But they made a key error. They felt leadership could be transferred without repercussions, and their silence was the sole proof of allegiance." He turned to me, tired but determined. "But I gave them an unexpected note. I rang their bell incorrectly. I made them look twice, and in looking they scattered. And the system?" "Severed," Holmes replied. "The last hub has been dismantled, the tunnels filled, and the receivers destroyed. It will take years to reconstruct if anyone dares. However, the sound is no longer present. No bell will ring again." I served him tea and finally allowed myself to breathe. "And what of you?" He gave the faintest smile. "I will rest. For a short duration. Though I anticipate the next mystery may not come with such a friendly caution." He sipped and then sat back. The fire crackled softly, and outside the city shook with its customary sounds. Carts, hooves and the murmur of morning trade. But somewhere beneath the stone and soot, the tunnels were now empty. The echoes stopped, and Sherlock Holmes, who had answered a toll that no man should have heard, sat silently in the light, waiting for stillness rather than a signal.